Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Centre Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Australia's Ambassador to Korea, James Choi. Many of you will know James. He has previously spoken at the Perth US Asia Centre on several occasions. As you may know, since our inception nearly 7 years ago, we have run a regular series of what we call Ambassadors Dialogues, small off-the-record roundtable conversations in the beautiful Senate room at the University of Western Australia. We've been doing these virtually in this current COVID era. And Ambassador Choi, just a couple months ago, was kind enough to join us for one of these virtual sessions. And that conversation was so insightful that we thought that we really needed to give him an opportunity to speak to a broader audience and for us to share this conversation with the full community that we have here at the Perth US Asia Centre. Ambassador Choi really needs no introduction. I think most of you know him, but he is a senior officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He previously served as Australia's ambassador to Denmark. He had earlier postings at the United Nations in New York, previously in Korea, and has had some senior roles back in Canberra as well, including as a senior advisor for Asia in the Office of the Prime Minister and as a senior advisor in the Office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And more importantly, from our perspective, as someone myself who spent the better part of 30 years focused on Korea, he's been both a mentor, a friend, and a partner in crime, if you will, in understanding developments on the Korean Peninsula, and in recent days, understanding their implications for Australia and for the broader Indo-Pacific region. So James, thank you so much for making the time and for joining us for this conversation today.
Gordon, thank you very much for that kind invitation, and it's wonderful to be here again in front of the Perth US Asia Centre audience. But your flattery, I think, is overdone because, frankly, I'm the student and you are the teacher. You're the expert on Korea, given your extensive history and experience working here on the Korean Peninsula. So I learned so much from you in our discussions. But thank you very much for that kind welcome.
Well, that kindness aside, we at the Perth US Asia Centre like to talk about us being Australia's Indian Ocean capital and the fulcrum of the Indo-Pacific, and we make a great deal of the fact that we're in the same time zone as Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Manila, Hong Kong, and Beijing, just an hour away from Seoul and Tokyo, as well as Delhi. But the reality is we're down at the bottom and you're at the top, and you're right there in Seoul. This year marks the first time since 1986 that I am not going to visit South Korea. So I very much miss our conversations there, from the briefings that I get from you and the wonderful team that you have with you at the embassy. And so what we're going to do right now is have a virtual conversation. This is my selfish ability to use our community as an excuse for me to learn from you about what's happening on the ground today.
That's fantastic.
Let's go ahead and launch right into it if we could. Korea, like every country in the globe, and obviously Australia and the United States as well, is battling with this COVID-19 pandemic. It's quite interesting that Korea and my homeland, the United States, both had their first public cases of COVID-19 announced on the first day. And if I recall correctly, the first deaths were announced almost simultaneously as well in terms of that. And yet there has been widely divergent responses in South Korea and the United States, as well as other countries around the world. South Korea, obviously, is a global economy, a globally focused economy with a trading economy, a highly international population, has had some real impacts in terms of this COVID-19 pandemic. Could you kind of walk us through their response, what it's meant for the society, and then given the importance of their economy, what it's meant for their economy?
Sure, Gordon. Firstly, Korea was one of the first countries to be hit by COVID-19. So at the outbreak of the virus in Hunan, and also the spread of the virus, Korea was one of the first countries to be hit. So the initial spike of cases in Korea was enormous, and there was quite a lot of tension and concern within the Korean community, Korean government, as to how Korea would go about responding to this. But what Korea had was the lessons of the past, the lessons of dealing with SARS and MERS. And from the mistakes that it had made previously, it had already initiated and learnt from those lessons a range of institutions and guidelines on how to deal with these infections. So once COVID-19 hit Korea, Korea was ready. So it instantly set up mobile stations of testing. It already had testing kits ready to go. It had government business cooperation dealing with this situation. the hospitals were ready to go in dealing with COVID-19. And so what we saw was an impressive whole of country response to COVID-19. So Korea was one of the first countries to enter the COVID-19 curve, but also one of the first countries to flatten the COVID curve successfully. But what was unique to Korea compared to many other countries is that it kept its borders open. It was committed to the principle of openness. So despite the strong quarantine regulations, social distancing, working from home arrangements, it kept the borders open. So remarkably, flights were still coming to and from Seoul from China. Flights were still continuing from Seoul to Washington and many countries throughout the world. The Korean government wasn't prepared to give up its sense of openness and the lifeline to the world, which is its export economy and exports and imports, which drives the Korean society. But at the same time, the impressive response in terms of the COVID-19 flattened the curve successfully. I can't say that it's eradicated COVID-19 because I don't think that's possible. But what you've seen is this steady flattening of the curve and a minimization of the risk while addressing the issue of keeping the economy alive. But that said, Korea's economy is not really different from many other countries. It's been hit badly. Given that 40% of Korea's economy relies on exports, its export market has been hit by the downturn in the US economy, European economy, the global economy. But what we've seen, though, is that Korea doing probably worse than many other countries. In fact, of all the OECD countries, its economic growth is really at the top of the charts. It's contracted -1 or 2%, which is stark difference to the significant double-digit contraction of economic growth in countries such as the United States or in Europe or in the rest of Asia. And that's because of a couple of factors. Korea's very focused in terms of economy on manufacturing. Semiconductors especially has kept its economy alive. So as we've gone into the contactless society, as we've moved to video conferencing, working from home, Korea's been supplying all the things that actually drives the contactless society. And so companies such as SK Hynix, Samsung Electronics have actually seen a boost in performance in this difficult situation, have kept the Korean economy alive. But that said, there have been some major losers in the Korean economy: services, small businesses. But that's been kept alive by a massive injection of funds from the Korean government, like many other countries throughout the world, including Australia. The fiscal stimulus has kept the Korean economy alive, which has minimized unemployment. In fact, unemployment is still around about 4%, which is quite remarkable compared to international benchmarks. But overall, I think Korea's international standing as a result of its successful COVID-19 response has actually been enhanced. If you think of some of the monikers for Korea's place in the world, K-pop, K-drama, its successful brands such as LG, Samsung, Hyundai, it's been augmented by its successful response to COVID-19. In fact, there's another word that's developed, K-방역 or K-quarantine in English, which reflects Korea's successful COVID-19 response. In fact, the head of COVID-19 response here in Korea, the head of Korea's Center for Disease Control, Jung Eun-kyung, who's dispassionate and also science-based response to COVID-19, which has been taken up fully by the Korean government. She's become a hero, not just in Korea, but a role model for the world. If you look at Time's top 100 influential people list, Jung Eun-kyung, the head of Korea's Center for Disease Control, is in it. So Korea's standing in the world has certainly been enhanced, not just economically, but in terms of soft power, has been enhanced by its response to COVID-19.
I wonder if I might dig a little bit deeper on that. Korea obviously had prior experiences with SARS, with MERS, and so it was aware of the risk to its society, to its health, to its economy from pandemics like this. But at a very fundamental level, what I hear you describing is a society, a democratic society, where there still is a heavy respect for science, a heavy respect for medicine, kind of fact-based decision-making, something that seems to have been in short supply in democratic societies globally. How do you explain that tendency in Korea in its response to COVID?
I think there's a sense of mobilization that Korea can implement in the event of crises. I think that there's a sense of trust in some of the institutions, especially, as I mentioned, KCDC, Korea Center for Disease Control, given the experiences of the past. But I actually take this down to so many commentators have tried to point out Korea's Confucian culture, that somehow top-down government-led responses are taken on board by the people and people are willing to listen. There's an element of that, but I think the more important thing in this response that has led Korea out of this COVID-19 curve has been the sense that they internalize risk and they sort of get on with it. There's a sense, especially, that Korea's lived with other risks, such as North Korea, previous pandemics, such as MERS and SARS. They simply get on with it and listen to what needs to be done, and they move on. So I think there's a sense of internalizing risk among the population, willing to listen to science and reasonable arguments, and the whole society tends to mobilize very, very quickly. So there is an element of Confucianism, the sense of strong pragmatism, just getting along, getting over it and done. As you know from your experiences in Korea, Gordon, Korea is the most pragmatic society in the world.
Well, look, I think once we manage globally to get through this pandemic, there's going to be a lot of interest in different responses to the virus. Early on, there was, I think, a rather shallow debate about, whether dictatorial or kind of state-led societies that were less free were more effective at responding to it than democratic societies. But then you look at countries like New Zealand, obviously, given the popularity of its leader, who's got a lot more attention than maybe its population might merit. Taiwan, which is probably arguably the best response in the globe, despite their real proximity to China. South Korea, also democratic. Vietnam, not democratic, but nearby, have all had remarkable responses. And even we here in Australia have had two very different models, right? I mean, Western Australia, what has long been considered to be the tyranny of distance now turns out to be, the wonderful freedom of isolation, where we're able to kind of shut ourselves off from the rest of the world. That's one strategy, but it actually is very different than the strategy that Korea has approached. So again, fascinating. We could continue this conversation for a long time. You did note several times, however, Korea's important national characteristic of being a trading nation. That's clearly how, other than the Korean War, many Australians understand Korea. They focus on Korea as an export destination for iron ore, for these days increasingly LNG, and obviously as a source for much of our own consumer products here in Western Australia. I wonder if you might talk to us a little bit about Korea's role, along with Australia, in the global trading architecture. Korea, along with Australia, is a negotiating partner in an agreement called the RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership. If all goes well, and this is what we hear out of Canberra, that despite the difficulties of the COVID era, they anticipate they will come up with some agreement on this Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership by the end of this year. Could you talk about what that means for Korea? Obviously, in 2014, we signed a bilateral free trade agreement with South Korea. So probably bilaterally, there's less to be gained there. But I'm curious as to your view of Korea as a leader, Korea as a partner with Australia in this effort to kind of move forward on regional, if not global, trade liberalization.
I'll simply draw on my previous comment. Korea is a very pragmatic country. In terms of pragmatism, there's nothing more vital to Korea than trade. I think I mentioned previously that 40% of Korea's economy relies on its exports. It's a higher percentage than Australia, indeed, higher percentage than many other countries in the world. So it relies on that supply chain of how Korea fits into the Asian and global economy. In terms of Korea's interest in RCEP, it really is all about ASEAN and engagement with India, but obviously India has fallen off RCEP's radar for the time being. But Korea is desperately interested in diversifying its export markets. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion in Australia about diversifying our export profile, But Korea's been undertaking this diversification strategy for a while, especially following the Chinese retaliation to Korea after the deployment of an anti-missile defense system, THAAD, under the Park Geun-hye administration. At that time, it was a wake-up call for Korea that it needed to reduce its reliance on China. So RCEP is an integral part of Korea's diversification strategy. It sees significant prospects for furthering investment and trade ties with Indonesia, Vietnam, Mekong countries. RCEP is a key vehicle to drive Korea's diversification strategy. But Korea already has bilateral free trade agreements with many ASEAN countries, but RCEP will be another driver for further enhancing bilateral arrangements, but also stimulating Korean business interest in moving towards those ASEAN countries. But that said, this is almost government policy following the footsteps of Korean companies. Because if you look at what the big Korean companies have already done in ASEAN, it's quite significant. Samsung Electronics moved into Vietnam decades ago. If you look at Vietnam's export profile, 20% of Vietnam's exports is actually Samsung Electronics. If you look at Indonesia, the big investors such as POSCO and Hyundai Motors are already there in a big way. So Korean companies already moved into ASEAN. RCEP, though, will formalize and also institutionalize Korea's trading and investment relationship with RCEP countries. I guess, though, for me as Australian ambassador, RCEP won't really stimulate Australia-Korea bilateral ties because our bilateral free trade agreement is of a much higher standard already. But what I'm interested, though, in terms of regional architecture is the future question of CPTPP and where Korea stands in that discussion. It's not yet there with Korean interlocutors on whether Korea will start looking at CPTPP. There are big variables in Korea's interest, especially on whether the US will eventually show some interest in CPTPP. But there are some significant political issues domestically with Korean economy and Korean sectors in relation to CPTPP liberalisation, especially on issues such as autos and agriculture, which obviously leads to domestic sensitivities.
I presume, obviously, Japan's leading role in the CPTPP complicates that. But I would note, I really do appreciate you raising that in the context of RCEP, because while a lot of the media attention in Australia this year is appropriately focused on the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, in my view, in the last 4 years, the most significant development on the global trade front was the effort, primarily by Australia and Japan, to resurrect that Trans-Pacific Partnership and at least hold hold that space, right, in the form of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, in the hopes that, you know, in 3 weeks, the U.S. presidential election might lead to a different outcome where the United States might come back in. And my guess is that would probably change Korea's thinking about TPP as well. So it's kind of a wait and see, if you might agree with that. So.
I totally agree. I think the key variable for the Republic of Korea will indeed be US interest in CPTPP. That may change Korea's calculations.
Let's move on to talk a little bit about the bilateral relationship, if we could. You mentioned that South Korea has made a decision to remain open and to kind of handle its response to COVID in that way. Australia has pursued a very different strategy. Not just Western Australia, but Australia as a whole has largely been locked down at this point. And as a result, we don't have the tourists that normally would be flowing in from Korea. We don't have the students that would normally be flowing in from Korea. We don't have the business delegations in the same numbers that we would normally get in from Korea. And that's a real challenge for a relationship like that between Australia and Korea. So I wonder if you might help us kind of take stock of Australia-Korea bilateral relations in 2020, and then look forward, because, you know, this pandemic will end. There will be a light at the end of the tunnel. At 2 or 3 areas where you think there's real promise for further developments in our bilateral relationship with the Republic of Korea.
Firstly, Gordon, you've already highlighted some of the strengths of the bilateral trade and investment relationship. We supply all the raw materials that fuels the Korean economy. Our relationship with companies such as POSCO is long-standing. Our iron ore and coal feeds into the manufacturing of steel here in Korea, which in turn is exported to the rest of the world. So the strong complementarity exists and will continue to endure into the future. And they will be the mainstays of our trade and investment relationship for the short term. But in terms of looking into the future and the prospects and opportunities for bilateral trade and investment, we just simply have to look at the transformation of the Korean economy, in many parts accelerated by COVID-19, but also some of the trends that were already in place before COVID-19. And it is a Korean economy that is moving away from the traditional industries, auto, steelmaking, petrochemicals. While they are still the mainstays, you just have to look at the transformation of the top tier of Korean companies. In the top 10 companies in Korea's stock exchange now, you see many names that many Australians wouldn't have heard before. Celltrion, SK Bio, Samsung Biologics. So in that bio area, which again has been enhanced by COVID-19 and Korea's response. Bio is the hottest area of Korea's economy at the moment. Again, prompted by COVID-19, but also supported by very strong government support to accelerate biotechnology. But also in the top 10 Korean companies, you have companies such as KakaoTalk. For those who have been to Korea and have used Kakao Chat, you'd be surprised that Kakao is now, in terms of market capitalization, larger than Hyundai Motors itself. You have Naver, a chat company that's taking on the world, and again, listed in the top 10. It's the transformation of Korea's economy into digital, bio, high value-added manufacturing, which will create further opportunities for Australia. And these are areas that, certainly from the Australian Embassy perspective, we'll need to further look at how Australia can feed into that supply chain, given our own strengths and contribution in these areas. The other area I'd be looking at in terms of future prospect is Korea's transformation into a lower carbon, higher value-add economy, especially under President Moon's ambitious plans to have a new Green Deal, where Korea will enhance its reliance on renewable energy, but also start moving into the hydrogen economy and looking at battery technology. We're already seeing some big bets made by Korean companies in the areas of hydrogen cars, hydrogen fuel cells, but also in terms of its investment in renewable energy. Companies such as Hanwha Solar are world leaders in solar cell manufacture. So again, we need to start looking at how we feed into the supply chain, but this will also stimulate Korean investment in Australia in these themes, as we have a lot to offer, especially in the hydrogen supply chain, but also in the chemicals and critical minerals that go into battery manufacture. I guess the last theme that I'd put forward as a future opportunity for Australia is the aging Korean society. Korea is going to be, or it already is, one of the most rapidly aging societies in the world. And as it does so, it is desperate need of enhancing its future pension capabilities. And what we're already seeing is Korean asset managers, the national pension system, looking desperately for yield, safe yield. And you're seeing greater investment in Australia because of the opportunities that we provide in safe, stable returns. So investments in our infrastructure, our tollways, our buildings, commercial property. Korean interest in Australia is enhanced because of the aging theme. So these are the themes that we are looking at in terms of the Australian Embassy, and no doubt will lead to future channels of investment and trade between Korea and Australia.
Well, thank you. That's actually extremely promising. You won't be surprised to know that as we look at it here from Western Australia, there is growing interest in Korea. There's a focus on a potential hydrogen superhighway here. And obviously with the expertise that Korean firms have and the investments they're making, that makes them highly attractive. Also, it seems to me that there's a real opportunity for Australia to kind of steal a march on some of our competitors globally. given our response and relative success to the COVID-19 pandemic when compared with, say, the United States or the United Kingdom. And one of my hopes is that national policymakers in Canberra, as well as state policymakers in individual states like Western Australia, will recognize that if you're looking for new students and you're looking to diversify the base of those students and you're looking for tourists, that Korea is kind of the lowest of the low-hanging fruits. And you're going to have 50 million relatively well-off South Koreans who are going to be slightly more hesitant about traveling to the UK or to Europe or to the United States. And if we just open the doors and facilitate a process for them coming to here, this is a real opportunity for Australia. But it requires, and this is an area where I presume you agree with me, us getting our own country here to kind of focus on those opportunities and potential. So thank you. Thank you for kind of laying that out. It's helpful.
I'll just add one extra thing, Gordon. For our students in tourism market, I totally agree. There'll be very important service exports that we will be marketing here in Korea. But at the same time, though, I think we need to do more to attract Koreans to come to Australia. I think we've done all the easy parts of attracting students, attracting tourists, but we have to also look at how we target our products to market to Korean consumers. I think there's been much more work done to make sure that we market our products successfully to the Korean market and not simply assume that simply by opening our borders that Koreans will come. It just requires more legwork and more investment in the Korean market.
Well, and your remarks also remind me that my status as a so-called Korea expert also has an expiration date, because number one, I've never used Kakao Talk and I can't list the names of the members of BTS. And so clearly yes. I'm not as up to date as I need to be. Let's move on.
At least you know BTS. That's impressive in itself.
Well, I did. I was about to quip that of all Korea's exports that have continued during the pandemic unabated, apparently if BTS continue to drop new singles, there's one thing that has not been impacted in terms of the process.
Well, I actually was going to make reference to that, Gordon. And one of the big winners out of this COVID-19 era for Korea has been its cultural exports. And BTS is at the top of that list. Its recent single Dynamite debuted #1 in Billboard, and estimates suggest that song in itself, is worth to the Korean economy about $1.3 billion US. Over the next 3 years, with BTS's continued success, there are estimates which suggest that BTS will bring into the Korean economy about $20 billion. So this is an aspect of Korea's soft power, its cultural exports, which provides insight into the new Korean economy, but also Korea's reach into the world. I think it's something that we shouldn't undervalue and underestimate.
Well, here again lies the task for me, because I was aware of the title Dynamite, but I've actually never heard the song or listened to it. And there are plenty of Korean dramas being played in my household at this moment during COVID, as they are around the world, but I haven't watched them. So clearly some work to do on my part if I want to brush up my credentials. Let's move and talk about the region if we could. Australia has focused for a long time on what we consider the Indo-Pacific region. Our 2017 foreign policy white paper used the Indo-Pacific as an organizing construct for the region, and countries like Japan and Indonesia and India, even ASEAN has an Indo-Pacific outlook. South Korea has chosen to phrase its regional strategy slightly differently. In 2017, President Moon Jae-in visited Indonesia and proclaimed the launch of a Sinnambang 정책, a new southern policy. That has sort of been like an Indo-Pacific policy. It has been South Korea focusing into ASEAN. In recent years, that has been expanded to have a particular focus on Indonesia and to include India. But at least from my perspective here in Australia, I'm not quite clear where Australia fits into the new Southern policy and how that overlaps with our own strategy in the region. Could you kind of help our viewers understand Korea's new Southern policy in its regional strategy as it looks?
Well, firstly, Gordon, you're absolutely right. There's a somewhat hesitant approach to the term Indo-Pacific here in Korea. It really stems from the fact that President Trump brought the Indo-Pacific term to Korea in his visit in 2017. Unannounced, without any preparations, he announced Indo-Pacific here in Korea during that visit in 2017. The Korean response at that time was they needed further details on what Indo-Pacific meant. There's been an evolution of Korea's response. Gradually, they've started to use the term Indo-Pacific. They are willing to use the term in formal language. They've had discussions on Indo-Pacific with the United States. In fact, in our bilateral discussions, Korea is willing to use that term Indo-Pacific. But you're right, though, in terms of formal constructs and in terms of institution building, Korea prefers the term New Southern Policy. And obviously, it's because Korea resides right next to China. And that sensitivity frames its consideration of how it balances its approach to the term Indo-Pacific, or indeed the constructs of Indo-Pacific. But the New Southern Policy is very much in line with certainly what Australia is doing with its Indo-Pacific strategy, looking at diversifying relationship, putting ASEAN at the centre of engagement in the region, not just in terms of economic strategy, but also people-to-people links and a strategic overlay. But most importantly, it's driven for Korea, as I mentioned previously, to further diversify export markets for its companies. But in terms of New Southern Policy for Australia, we're not very worried about whether Australia is part of Korea's New Southern Policy or outside of the New Southern Policy, whether Korea wants to be putting us into that basket with the ASEANs, because frankly, from my perspective as ambassador here in Seoul, Australia's relationship with Korea is qualitatively different from Korea's relationship with ASEANs anyway. So it's more about substance that I'm more worried about. It's how we take forward Korea's strategic partnership, Australia's strategic partnership with Korea, and how we enhance our strategic dialogues, how we share views on the region, and the institutions that will allow us to exchange views and perspectives, and how we cooperate to contribute to the rules-based order in the region, how we work together to shape the future of our region. And that's aside from New Southern Policy, it's really through the institutions that we've built bilaterally and regionally. So for Australia, the important dialogue is the 2+2, ministerial engagement. For Korea, it only has two 2+2 arrangements, one with the US, one with Australia. That in itself is a signal about the importance of Korea and Australia working together in the region. We have a range of other dialogues, especially strategic dialogue at officials level, Indo-Pacific talks, North Asia talks. We work closely in APEC, East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, G20. So they're the strands of cooperation that we need to continue to build, where we talk about how we develop a shared view of the region. And this is an ongoing work. Korea's perspective will always be tied up by the politics, the zero-sum politics in Northeast Asia. We in Australia are very much free from those dynamics, not totally immune, but certainly relatively free as compared to Korea. So it's meeting in the middle and how we define our shared interests, how we build our strategic cooperation, and look at the strands and links where we continue to build this strategic dialogue. And that's my most important priority as ambassador, as opposed to trying to make sure that Korea puts us into the New Southern Policy.
Thank you. I really appreciate that final point about how Australia and Korea, rather than working just on the bilateral, because the bilateral relationship is good, it's strong, it's remarkable, it's arguably the best it's ever been. Then the real question is, what do you do with that? And you noted, in addition to the 2+2, cooperation in a lot of the different regional fora. Can you just give us a little bit more about what you think that the two countries can do together in the Indo-Pacific or the southern area, however, the southern direction is, however you want to phrase it? What is it that we as two democratic societies who have relatively strong economies, despite the difficult circumstances in which we find ourselves, who have had relatively robust responses to COVID-19, can do together in the coming years?
Well, most immediately, it's the response to COVID-19. And we already have been working closely on how we start looking at the distribution of a future developed vaccine. We're working closely on the COVAX facility, how we share notes on our domestic responses, but also how we compare our responses and contributions to the region. That in itself also is an area of growing cooperation between our two countries, not just bilaterally, but regionally. But ultimately, though, it's issues that will overlap in the region. Things such as cybersecurity, maritime security, disaster relief, our contribution to resilience in Southeast Asia, our overlap as Australia looks northwards through our Indo-Pacific engagement, as Korea looks southward in its New Southern policy, how we compare notes and build resilience with our engagements with Southeast Asian countries. As I mentioned, Korea's reach in countries such as Vietnam and Indonesia on issues such as infrastructure, development assistance. Korea's got significant capabilities in water, which is critical to the development of the resources in Southeast Asia, but also how Australia goes about its own investments in infrastructure and development assistance, how we build resilience and alternatives to cooperation in the region. That's where Australia and Korea should be cooperating much more intensively in the future. And that's part of our bilateral agenda as we take things forward through the 2+2 and other officials dialogues. But ultimately, I think Korea is going to be looking at the levers that it has built up from all the things that we said. Its trade engagement with the region, its successful marketing of its soft power. Korea is going to come to a point where it has all these levers in Southeast Asia where we should be tapping into, not necessarily bilaterally, but how we work together as like-minded countries, democracies, committed to the rules-based order, committed to free trade. The commonality between Australia and Korea is enormous. But as you mentioned, Gordon, it's not going to be just bilateral, but how we utilize those links to contribute to a shared vision for the region.
Well, you've put together a pretty ambitious kind of to-do list for you and your colleagues there in the embassy, for your counterparts in the Korean government and their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as our shared colleagues in Canberra. I myself have come away from this conversation with my own kind of homework. I've got to watch that BTS video. Don't know that I'm going to sign up for Kakao Talk anytime soon. We're kind of in a Southeast Asia WhatsApp bubble here, but we're working on it. But thank you, James. This has been highly enlightening. And my hope is that those in our broader and growing community at the Perth US Asia Center who watch this and who are, as all of Australia is right now, looking at our relationships in the region anew. I think in the last 6 months, Australia has experienced some of the downside of a high concentration of our trade, investment, export markets, and recognizing the need to expand our trade, to expand the countries with we work, and to grow those relationships. And obviously, Korea is in a great spot, but from hearing your telling of it today, there's a lot more potential there for us to continue to expand the relationship, our cooperation in the region, and our own deepened bilateral relationship. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gordon, and thanks for your own efforts in promoting Australia-Korea relations. And I'm very well aware of your role in being the vanguard of Indo-Pacific studies in Australia. So congratulations on your continued role.